We've been working our way through Albert Camus' book The Rebel, and we got to the point where he was actually devoting most of his attention to the Soviet Union and communism under that regime. So he began it, just to recapitulate quickly, he started off describing the need for rebellion, and that, according to his idea, and something that he looked at in some of his earlier books, is because of this dilemma that the human race finds itself in, where we have a brief moment of self-awareness and consciousness, and then there's nothing. And that's an intolerable situation. We have to rebel, react against that. So either we have to react against God, who made us and put us in that intolerable situation, or it seems almost that he's saying not so much that, but we have to react against the fact that there isn't a God. There should have been a God who should have made us and should have given us this consciousness which continues and doesn't, it's come to non-existence, but continues indefinitely. And when people have tried to point out to him, well, actually that is the case, God has made us like that with this ongoing awareness and consciousness forever, he rejects that idea and says, no, there is no such God, but there should be, and that's what, and we have to rebel against him because he hasn't done that for us. It kind of seems illogical, but and he doesn't say that outright, but that's the impression that I get anyway from reading his books. And it's almost like the idea of a biological father who's conceived one and then disappeared, abandoned one completely, and has no part in one's life from that point onward. And interestingly, there's another book of Camus called The First Man, which I don't think many people have read or perhaps are even conscious that it exists, but it wasn't published until long after Camus had died, and he hadn't even finished writing it before he died. But I think that may perhaps be a kind of a semi-fictional account of his own father's life. Anyway, but that's just conjecture on my part, really. So he started off talking about why the people need to rebel, and then he's gone into some of the forms that rebellion took, particularly looking at people who have lived outrageous lives. So he started with the Marquis de Sade, and then he talked about some of the key figures of the Romantic period in history, people like Byron and so on. And that kind of outrageous living is the way that one needs to rebel. Then he talked about some of the philosophical underpinnings of the whole thing, particularly Hegel, and then the most obvious outworking of Hegel's ideas in the nihilists, especially in Russia in the 19th century, and then moving on to Marx a bit later in the 19th century. And the idea there was that we human beings must be continually moving towards some distant future goal which is undefined. We can't really visualise it, but we have to keep going there in this evolutionary state. And in order to do that, we have to remove everything that is here now, give up everything, and that includes our ideas of morality, of religion, of even science and art and the physical perception of things. All that we must be prepared to leave all that behind, and more than that, we must be prepared to actually actively destroy it to make way for the next stage, and so that we progress towards this goal. In Marx's case, you looked at a week or so ago, Marx opened the possibility that there may be an end point, that history may achieve its final objective of this ideal proletarian dictatorship, and history will come to an end and there will be no need to do anything more. But the true nihilists, Hegelians, would say, well, no, that's not enough. We've got to get rid of that too, because that's just one more synthesis in this dialectic. That's got to go so that we can make way for what's happening next. Anyway, so that's just a brief resume of where we've gone. And then in last week's episode, Camus had been saying that in Marx's writing, there's as well as his analytical study, there's a kind of a prophetic element which has almost a kind of a supernatural aspect to it, and particularly a satanic aspect to it. So in this week's episode, which is where we should have begun, Camus devoting most of his time and effort to looking at Soviet communism. And he'd briefly looked at Nazism and regimes like that, but they were fairly ephemeral. But now Soviet communism, at the time when he wrote the book, which was the early 1950s, that was a major influence and reality in the world. And I suppose the whole idea of rebellion and revolution was largely centred in that idea of communism as being experimented with, lived out by the Soviet Union. So he devotes a fair bit of the book to looking at that. So, but he still does make one more aside just before he goes into that, and that is to say that he compares the 19th century and the 20th century, and he makes this comment that in the 19th century, talking about the rebels in general, the 19th century was a struggle for justice against grace. So the people wanted to make things better, make things right, get rid of this unjust situation they're in, but they didn't want to have to rely on some kingdom of heaven coming to make it right, or God's grace making it right, as religious people might do. They couldn't accept that because they didn't want to be dependent on God or on God's grace. But somehow they had to find a way to achieve justice by some other means that cut God out of the picture. So that was the 19th century, a struggle for justice against grace. But the 20th century, Camus said, involved a struggle for justice against truth. So going even further, they wanted to get things right, to get the conditions of our living better, but truth shouldn't be involved in it. And that's going back to Hegel again, I suppose we have to abandon what we regard as truth. So it's a very difficult situation, really. You want to make things right, but you don't want God to be involved. You want to make things right, but you don't want truth to be involved. And this is kind of the world of the rebel, as Camus envisages it, really. So he talks again about Nietzsche. His idea was that this will to power of human beings grasp the fact that we are alone, that we can become supermen, we can just do whatever we want to do, our will be supreme, we'll achieve whatever we like. That's one way perhaps to do that. And so finally getting to the point about Russian Soviet communism. So this is Camus saying about this that he describes this as somehow being a return to the metaphysical rebellion that he spoke about in earlier chapters. All principles are negated and there's continual domination, ostensibly in the service of man for some far distant goal, but the process involves abandoning every principle and a continual state of domination. So then he goes on to talk about Lenin as being one of the, I suppose, main ideologists and practitioners of this whole process. So he says Lenin believed that there must be no morality in revolution. So I guess, again, getting rid of the principles of what we consider right and wrong, all that's got to go. So morality has to be completely put to one side or removed out of the scene. Lenin also believed that there should be no separation between the proletariat and the revolutionaries. So the whole idea of Marxist revolution was to the proletariat, basically the working class who have been oppressed by the bourgeoisie and before that by the aristocracy and the royalty. The proletariat must come to the fore and the world must be theirs. They must own it and everything in it. But in practice, of course, Lenin belonged to a revolutionary group, and the Bolsheviks were the ones that carried out the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that established that Marxist-Leninist state. So Lenin's saying there should be no separation between those. They are one and the same. the revolutionaries are the revolution, they are the proletariat. But at the same time, he recognises that in a way there is a separation. And of course, in practice, there must be. I mean, the proletariat is this big mass of people. The revolutionaries are a small group of maybe a few dozen people who have to make the decisions and put them into practice. So then Lenin is saying the main activity of this revolutionary group is basically military, so violent action, to oppose the kind of a secret police of the autocracy of the Tsarist regime and actively beat them. And this revolutionary group is a kind of a secret society, a bit like the Jesuits, and sort of based on that Jesuit system, even with a kind of asceticism involved, but struggling continually to oppose something and break it down. But then he comes across the question of, and this is Lenin talking as well, and Camus looking at what Lenin's saying, discussing that whole question that we've just been looking at, is there eventually an end point, or does the dialectic go on continually? So Lenin at one stage allows the fact that eventually the proletariat state will have been achieved, the bourgeoisie will have been eliminated, the means of production will be totally in the control of the proletariat. What's left of the peasants, the lower middle class, he allows some of them may still be around, they'll still be allowed to exist, and the semi-proletariat that aren't the true proletariat. All of those groups may combine with the proletariat to construct this perfect socialist society. Having done that, then the proletariat state will be able to wither away because there'll be no need for that. So there'll be just this perfect socialist society. And perhaps that's Marx's end of history. But then on the other hand, there will always be a need for some sort of repression to continue because there may be some reaction against it that might crop up again. So there will always be a need to keep fighting against that, to keep military dictatorship or bureaucratic dictatorship or some sort of repressive mechanism in place. So Lenin sort of allows the possibility of some highest perfect stage of socialism. But then he also says, well, we can't really totally envisage that or imagine that, so maybe that will never be achieved, and maybe there'll be an endless need for repressive dictatorship of some form. And this, Camus doesn't say this, but that's kind of the vision that comes out of Orwell's 1984, I suppose.